Welcome everyone. So this evening, I'd like to start off these quick sessions, just talk a little bit about our pasture outlook and the grazing for the upcoming 2023 season. Of course, we look back a little bit. Every drought we've had has been a little bit different. And so the response or the comeback, if you will, after drought can be a little bit different as well. Of course, some of the key things that everybody knows that our spring precipitation, particularly April, May, and June, especially if you got a lot of cool season pastures or brome grass, is very critical for our more native warm season dominated pastures. That May and June rainfall is really the key driver in our pasture production. And of course, last year we saw a lot of this when it was dry, that it's hard not to overgraze your pastures. But the thing we do have to keep in mind is that these grasses do have resiliency, and that's what we're going to be trying to assist with our management in getting those pasture grasses back to where they should be. Now, I want to show a couple of charts here really quick that kind of shows, I think, that tells the story really well what happens with our grasses. So in the green line is just representing the pasture growth or grass growth spring through fall, or from a two-leaf to almost a fall dormant stage. And then that red line is the energy or carbohydrate reserves of our grasses. So when growth starts in the spring, over here on the left, that energy reserve level is hopefully quite high. And it does use that energy for the initial growth in the spring. And once it gets to maybe the 4-leaf or so stage, it has the ability to start restoring or rebuilding its energy reserves, and it does that through the season. So at the end of the year, we hope that when fall comes, that our energy reserves in those grasses are up at that higher level. But what happened last year when we do have a drought, that summer growth got interrupted. And so basically, obviously, we didn't have that much plant growth all summer long, but yet we have to keep in mind that those energy reserves of the grasses were quite below average, if you will. So we are going into this spring, come here 2023, with relatively low levels from last fall. Of course, things we've seen with the drought is the reduced above ground growth, but you have to keep in mind too, there's a lot happening underground with our perennial grasses, and that underground root growth, of course, was hurt last year as well. Fewer reproductive tillers, and many of that certainly is important when we have, obviously could have thinner grass stands this year because we just didn't have the reproduction last year. And in some cases where we had very severe drought last year, those plants actually went into a dormancy. So some of the things for 2023, I think, that are going to be important. First of all, I'd say look back at your 2022 records or information, or go through your memory bank, see how you did some of the things related to your different pastures. But the key things are, for me, are always been the timing of grazing, the stocking rate, and how much residual herbage or forage did you leave in those pastures. And of course, as it should be done every year, outlining a plan for the upcoming season is going to be very important. And so one important thing too, with the drought last year, plus the heavy grazing, we know that that's going to mean reduced pasture production this year, even if we get average rainfall. And so we've seen this before. 2012 was another really good example with a severe drought, that in 2013, in many locations, we had near average rainfall in 13. But our grass production was still down just because of the impact of the 2012 drought. So plan on some reduction in stocking rate. Another item here, we talk about delaying turnout to your primary summer pastures. And what this does is allow the grasses to accumulate some growth and begin that recovery process. And of course, that's hard because we know hay is short. And when those grasses start to green up, we're going to want to get out there and get those cattle off of hay. But when all possible, I think it is a good idea. It'll pay off in the long run if you are able to delay that turnout, even as much as a week, or as short as a week, I should say. You probably will see more weeds in your pastures this year. This applies to all, whether it's a brome grass pasture or some sand hills pasture. Most of them are just annual weeds that they're there because the seed's always been there, and they have the opportunity to grow this year with the reduced vigor of our perennial pasture grasses. In most cases, we don't want to worry about them. They do have some good forage value. We've seen that in previous years as well. Another option for some people, it kind of depends, of course, what kind of cattle herd you're managing, when you calve, and that type of thing, is doing some early flash grazing. And this primarily applies to our native warm season grass pastures, like in the sand hills or anywhere where you might have an abundance of cool season growth. Now, this isn't the same as, of course, it may not sense when I talked earlier about delaying turnout, but flash grazing is just going through some of the pastures really quickly with your herd and basically capitalizing on any early growth of cool season grasses, as well as some weeds that might be out there. So that's another tip that some people can use as well. Another thing I think that's going to be important, if you do pasture rotations, the pastures that you grazed first last year and into July of 2022, I would delay grazing of those pastures until later in the summer. And this has a lot to do with some of the rapid growth phases of the grasses we talk about and how the grazing impacts on them. So with this is pretty important, I think. You're changing the time of grazing in your different pastures each year. And so that was my quick summary or an outlook and plans for the 2023 grazing, Randy. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Jerry. Our next speaker, and we'll take questions then, so keep track of your questions. You can put them in chat at any time, and we'll be glad to answer them at the end. Our next speaker is Karla Wilke. She's our feed system specialist, and she is going to talk about confinement feeding with alternative feeds, and she's done a lot of research on this also, and she also does it at home, so she's a great expert for us to hear from.
I'll turn my camera on too, so you know who you're listening to. Thank you, Randy. I don't know if expert's really right, but I'll sure share what I know. No, it doesn't want to change slide. There we go. Okay, so we can do confinement feeding anywhere that works for you. You just have to be creative and figure out where you want to do it. This is our equipment yard, and that's one of the places that we confinement feed. One of the things that we've done quite a bit of research on is limit feeding in confinement, where we make a diet that's very nutrient dense, and then we reduce the amount of actual feed that we feed so that we're still meeting the needs of the animal, but hopefully reducing some of the cost. When we do that, limit feeding though, bunk space or feeding space becomes extremely important, and we need a minimum of 2 feet per cow and about a foot or so for calves. It gets a little trickier when we have pairs and we have to account for the calf, but we're going to spend the last half of this talk talking about the calves, so we will cover that. The other thing that's important when we are doing limit feeding and confinement is a consistent feeding routine, so that we're feeding at the same time every day as much as we can. It's also extremely important to know the nutrient content of the commodities that we're working with, so that we do not overfeed or underfeed. So today, though, what I really wanted to talk about the most was this early lactation pair, because as Jerry just indicated, we're talking about delaying turnout, and this would be the pair that would be most affected by that if you were a spring calving operation. So I made this table, or this graph, I guess, to try to help illustrate what we're up against. So the gray bars are TDN, or total digestible nutrients, a measure of energy for the cow. And then the red bar is crude protein. And so this first set shows the requirements due to late gestation. And the second set shows the requirements due to early lactation. And you can see there's about a 50% increase in need because of lactation. So the third set shows, well, what if we say, well, I saved my best meadow hay for calf or after calving, and I increased my distiller's grains cubes to 3 pounds. We can do that, and it does increase what we feed over late gestation, but it still doesn't meet that need of early lactation. If we were able to go to grass, we had this lush green grass to graze and there was plenty of it, then it actually would meet the cow's needs and then some. So we would actually have her on an increasing plane of nutrition right before we turn the bulls out. And that'd be really cool. That'd be what we wanted. So a lot of times what we do is we depend on the body condition of the cows, the extra body condition that they might have put on in late fall after their last calf was weaned and through the winter to make up that difference between what their lactation need is and what our shortage might be in that, meadow hay and a little bit of extra cubes diet until we could go to grass. Well, this year, Jerry just told us that it's much better for the grass long-term if we delay that a little bit. So that adds a little bit of a problem for us. And then we had a very, very brutal winter this year, and cows probably used that extra condition score already. And then because we had a drought last year and we're in a feed shortage, then they just literally may not have that extra condition to give. So the first thing I wanted to run back over, and some of you may be very familiar with this, but we're going to talk about body condition scoring just for a brief slide or two. So the cows in this picture are in a pretty solid body condition score 6 on a 1 to 9 scale. When we evaluate body condition score, we don't want the hair coat to deceive us, and we don't want gut fill to deceive us. And so what we really want to evaluate very closely on these cows is the brisket area down here between her front legs. How much fill do we have there, conditioning? How much fat covers over these first front ribs here? Her spine along here, how prominent is that? How much coverings over that? How much covering or how prominent is this tail head? What about these pin bones right here? Can we see them very well? And then how much, when we stand behind her, how angular is her hip here? And try to evaluate how much cover she actually has. So on a 1 to 9 scale, this cow would be a 3. And so we can see that there's a lot. We can see everything on this poor cow, but her spinal column here is very prominent, very, very thin on all those spots that we look for, very angular, very evident there. A 5, which we would consider to be more moderate. We think a 5 and 6 is moderate on the scale where we'd like to see cows if we can. You can see there's quite a bit of difference between this 5 and that 3 as far as what you can see of her backbone, the fleshiness around her tail head and her hips, and as well. So why is that important? Well, it's important because there's research that shows that when they took serum samples or blood samples from baby calves that were 24 hours old and measured the concentration of immunoglobulin G that they would have in their system because they got that from that first meal of colostrum in those cows, right? What they found is the really thin cows, the 2, 3s, and 4s, had a lot less, their calves had a lot lesser concentration of the immunoglobulins than the cows that were in the 5 and 6. So that means that calf from the thin cow is at more risk of illness and not getting set up well for success. The other issue with that is body condition relates to the interval from calving to that first heat. So the thin cows take longer to come around to first heat. So if you found yourself in that situation where the winter was really gross and the cows are thinner than you'd like, and you're not in a position to really get them in that condition prior to the bulls being turned in, be prepared that your calving window may not be as tight, and that you might even consider running the bulls just a little bit longer so that you do catch those cows. So things to think about there. So if we have to do a lactation diet that does actually meet the cow's needs, because we can't go to grass, what would that even look like? So what I put together here was an example diet using ground corn stalks, wet distillers, and corn silage, and then you'd want a mineral packet in this, either mixed in with the feed or as a free choice. But I have it in pounds of dry matter, but also pounds as is, which you actually put in a mixture. And so we've got 10 pounds of corn stalks, 18 of distillers, and 35 of corn silage. That meets her needs, and it's a little bit limiting so that maybe she's cleaning that up pretty good for a 1,300 pound cow. We have extension personnel in the beef extension group that can help with ration balancing. If you're like, well, I have different commodities, and we can maybe help you walk through that. So let's take this last little bit here to just talk about managing that calf. Now, if we're going to delay grazing, like Jerry said that we need to do, then we are going to likely have a 3-month-old calf that hasn't gone to grass. So we have to think about meeting that calf's needs. And here's why. This is a graph that actually comes from the dairy industry, but you can extrapolate it to beef fairly well. Over on the left, we have a baby calf that's birthed to 3 weeks of age, and this esophageal groove closes when the baby calf suckles, and so the milk is shunted to the abomasum. And so it's a very large percentage of the total stomach capacity, where the rumen is only 25%. We go over here to phase 2, and this calf is 3 weeks to almost 3 months of age. We're up to 60%, hopefully, of the rumen, and our goal is to get over here where it's 85%. Now, age is not the only factor that happens here. In order for this rumen to develop, the baby calf has to have access to feed and water in addition to milk. So how much does a baby calf eat? So this research showed that the forage intake in pounds on an organic matter basis was 2.4 of a 3-month-old calf. So on a dry matter basis, organic matter just takes out the ash content. So if we kind of try to put that on a dry matter basis, that's probably 2.5 to 3, somewhere in there, pounds. And then if you had a 50% dry matter ration, then you would double that to actual feed. So, you know, it might be 5 to 6 pounds. And so every month you see that calf continues to eat more. And so the longer they're in confinement, the more you have to find a way to make that up for not only meeting the cow's needs of lactation, but feeding this calf. So again, I can't say this enough, that them being able to reach the water and the feed are very critical for that calf to go ahead and start developing that rumen, and for them to not dehydrate. Okay, so big deal. Okay, another thing that we do, and I don't like feeding on the ground because I think it does waste, but one thing that we do a lot of times with the calves is we come in the gate and we do sprinkle feed on the ground, and then we go put it in those pasture bunks, the rest of it. And the cows will start there and kind of start eating, but the cows are sure that you're putting the good stuff somewhere else, so they'll follow you, and it kind of strings them out a little bit. And then we get these calves to be able to then, eat some of that feed themselves without the competition of the cows. Obviously, you can creep feed, but one needs to be careful and evaluate the cost of creep feeding rations, because commercial creep feeds can be expensive. So make sure that the value of the gain, pencils out against the cost of that supplement. A creep gate that allows them to go into another pen, and you can put their own diet in there. That's maybe Mary and I've done some research with this, and so distillers, corn, and good hay or something in there, or maybe that's a creep area that they can go graze, but you don't have enough for the cows or something like that. The third picture, a guy put a hot fence up, the calves crawl under it, they eat with the cows, and the cows are fed, but then on out of the picture where you can't see, there's other feed that they have access to, so they don't have to compete. So those are all options. You probably have better options that I haven't thought of. So last point, we have a NEB guide on managing considerations for beef cows in confinement. If you go to ianrpubs.unl.edu, and in the little search bar, you type in that G2237, that's the number on the NEB guide, that should pop up, and you can download that, and that might be helpful to you. And then this is my contact information if you have more specific questions that we don't get covered in the chat. So I will stop sharing, Randy, and that's what I got.
Thanks, Karla. I appreciate that. If you have questions, make sure you put them in the chat, or we'll be answering questions afterwards. Our next speaker is Daren Redfern. Daren's going to talk about options for planting spring forage and grazing dates. Daren is kind of our small grains and forage specialist also, and he's going to talk about planting times and so forth. So Daren, I'll let you take it away.
Right. Thank you, Randy. You guys can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears back to more of the forage production, specifically focusing on planting spring forages, and also provide a little information on some grazing dates. As we know, there are not really many opportunities remaining in the year to produce forage for spring grazing or hay. One of the last remaining options is spring planted small grains. The options that we often fall back on are oats, spring triticale, or spring barley. All three of these can be planted in early spring for pasture or hay in the later spring to early summer. Tonight, what I'm going to briefly cover, or probably you guys will think I'm blowing through, are some of the options for spring forage, focusing a little bit on the small grains, talk a little bit about the forage cost and the value, and then also provide what I think are some of the key agronomic information and grazing dates. The reasons that we go to the small grains, I think there are five of them. The first one, they're pretty easy to establish. They can grow rapidly. They're usually productive. Sometimes they can be very productive. Often they're economical. And I think the important thing that oftentimes we sometimes forget is they do have the potential for some high quality, oftentimes some extremely high quality. The annual forage options we'll talk about. Small grains, as we've mentioned, are the traditional choice. We've mentioned the three that are usually the culprits are the oats, and then spring types of both barley and triticale. I'd like to point out that there are minor differences in seed price among the small grains. Talk briefly in a bit about including some spring field pea. That was usually included with oat, but the seed cost of it is oftentimes nearly twice as great as the small grains. When we think about establishing these, we used to think that small grain growth was greatly improved when the seed was drill planted somewhere from around 80 to 100 pounds of seed per acre. In areas with lower precipitation, we often reduce that to 40 to 60. One of the things that at least I've kind of settled on in my mind with this study and some other studies that we've worked on, where we looked at seeding rates of oats at four different rates of 25, 50, 75, or 100. And basically what we observed, at least at North Platte and Lincoln, was that the yield was similar at the 50, 75, and 100 pound rates. And it was all of those were greater than the 25 pound rate. Out at High Plains Ag Lab out in Sydney, that wasn't quite the case. Yields were very similar across all of those seeding rates. Although it's not presented here, seeding rate didn't influence forage quality. We included some nitrogen treatments in that, and based on this production that we've seen, it's important to account for probably 60 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre after establishment in eastern and central Nebraska, and probably can get by with no more than 30 pounds in some of the lower rainfall regions. Looking at some of the spring forage yields under good growing conditions, forage production from spring planted oats and any of the other small grains, typically we can expect the range of production to be from 2,500 to 5,000 pounds of forage per acre. These production estimates from this particular slide were pretty good. Oftentimes within a year, we'll see lower production, but typically what we always see are within the good years, we see very similar production. And in years that we don't have as good a production, we also see pretty similar production. And as I mentioned earlier, these yields probably should include a rate of about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. There's always questions about the best forage mixtures and the best seed proportions. Again, this is a Nebraska study that we conducted in Lincoln, North Platte, and Sydney. And I pulled out the data from the North Platte study, and we'll look at this because I think this paints a pretty good picture of what's going on. While there are some differences in these different seeding proportions, that 50-50 mix, that 35 pounds of each species, all these plots were fertilized with 60 pounds an acre. That particular treatment had one of the greatest forage yields. The approximate contributions were about 2/3 oats and about 1/3 pea. That was one I think is probably provides maybe the best opportunities for getting that increased forage quality in those mixes from the pea. The total seed cost for this mixture was a little over $42 an acre just for the seed. If we look at some of the other spring forage costs, I'd like to point out as you look at that, in particular down at the bottom in the total cost per acre, spring small grain forage is not inexpensive to grow. At the seeding rates that we've talked about for forage production and in the footnotes, I use 60 pounds of seed per acre for both oats and spring triticale. That oat and pea mix has the 35 pounds of seed per acre for each. But typically what we see here is that seed cost, including the planting, typically ranges from about $45 to $65 per acre. The nitrogen fertilization plus the application cost is generally about the same price. Typically the establishment cost, seed and planting, oftentimes will be slightly less than half, and the total cost for fertilization will be slightly greater than half. In total, the cost of producing small grains for grazing or hay likely will range from about $100 up to $125 per acre. That does exclude the land and the overhead. So some of the key forage management strategies, it's always important to consider past herbicide use. If we look at the seeding rates for small grains alone, 60 to 70 pounds per acre is a good starting place. For the small grains and the spring pea mixes, around 35 pounds an acre for each ought to be adequate. The reason that I've settled on these is that these rates are going to provide somewhere from around 25 to 35 live seed per square foot, which is adequate for stand establishment in many of these annual forages. Planting dates, typically we can begin around mid-March, all the way down in many areas of Nebraska. Anyone did much planting of small grains today. Planting date can continue through the early part of April. I think a good target to shoot for is around April the 1st. These planting dates can be earlier if soil temperatures are around 42 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit and increasing. Again, fertilization with about 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we'll touch on this again in a minute, but typically grazing can begin about 45 days after planting. If we're looking at a hay or silage harvest, we might increase that up to 70 or 90 days. Our stocking rates, again, our planting date is near April 1. We can expect the grazing to begin sometime in mid to late May. And in most instances, this can last until late June through early July. If we move on to the stocking rates, some of that forage cost information was based on a hay yield of 2.5 tons per acre. If you note, that red circle is around that information there. So that hay equivalent of 2.5 tons per acre is equivalent to a little over 3 AUMs per acre stocking rate. Effectively, this will provide about grazing for 2 cow-calf pairs for 30 days, or grazing for about 1.5 cow-calf pairs for 45. I think realistically, what we're looking at when we talk somewhat about grazing management, and Mary may touch on this a bit, but initially that might require earlier stocking rates, in particular during some of that early growth, because we do see some of the same things occurring in the annual forages that we do with the perennials with that early grazing. At that point, then we can adjust animal numbers upward as spring growth continues. Generally, what we see is a good stand of small grains could support around 2 cow-calf pairs for almost 6 weeks. If we look at the value of grazing, again, note the red circle around the approximate stocking rates there for our hay yield of 2.5 tons per acre. For reference, the forage cost per acre from that spring forage cost slide is on the bottom row of this slide. So from all this information, we can calculate a forage cost per AUM for these different forages. In this example, the AUM for 2 tons an acre hay equivalent ranges from a low of a little over $31 for oat pasture up to a little over $37 for the oat pea mix. Again, if you look at this, it's no secret that greater forage yields are going to have lower cost per AUM, and lower forage yields are going to have greater cost. If we look at some of the key management strategies, initial grazing date is going to depend on growing conditions and proper forage management strategies. We haven't talked a lot about when to start grazing from letting the plant tell us when to start, but typically what we like to do is wait on the height gets to be about 6 inches tall. And again, if we have a planting date around April 1st, and we can begin grazing in mid-May to the latter part of May. Small grain pasture is going to produce about 45 to 60 days of grazing. It's also important to note that grazing is not as efficient as hay, and we've talked about this already. That interrupts the forage growth and actually may reduce the production overall. Trampling losses are also occur in particular during if we have some heavier stocking rates. We can use simple rotations and use those to help us effectively use the harvest efficiency a little more strategic. The take-home messages, I think it's important to think beyond cost per acre when we start putting the pencil to these small grains, because they aren't cheap to produce. However, they can be a useful forage tool. They have the capability to provide a substantial amount of forage production in most years. Jerry alluded to this a little bit. I think one of the key things that they'll do for us this year is they'll help us reduce the grazing pressure on perennial grass pastures. And then in good years, that possibility does exist for a hay harvest to help offset the forage shortages just a bit further. That's all I have for this evening.
Thanks, Daren. Our last speaker is Mary Drewnoski. Mary is our beef system specialist, and she's going to talk about managing those cow-calf pairs on spring forages.
The key to making this all work, especially if we're thinking about filling this gap this year. We're looking at lactating cows, and they have high requirements. And as kind of Karla alluded to, our cows may not be in the greatest condition, but regardless, as they're going into breeding, we really want them on an increasing plane of nutrition, or at a very minimum, a steady plane of nutrition to have successful breeding. So we're talking about oats as an option of planting now, right? So we're talking about planting them today through, mid-April. And to recognize that that means that we're really looking at being able to graze, probably mid-May at the earliest, through maybe early July with oats or oats and peas. So it's not going to fill this really early gap that we may have, but it could, as Daren mentioned, relieve some pressure on your pasture, and make sure that you actually do have enough forage availability, especially with the potential for some of our perennial pastures to be set back. If you are looking for forage now may be the time to network with neighboring farmers. If they happen to plant cereal rye, this is a great opportunity. I think this year we're probably looking at mid-April to probably be able to start late planted rye, but it could fill this earlier gap, and it can be quite high quality. Regardless of the species, what we really see is that they all can be super high quality, whether it's oats, barley, triticale, rye, wheat, it does not matter. If we keep it short and vegetative, the quality is really great. We can get really good gains on calves, or we could meet that early lactation cow needs that Karla was talking about. Early lactation cow has high requirements, but the stuff we have can be very, very high quality. So I have just a table on here. This is before heading. So this is kind of boot stage, and we really want to keep it less than boot stage in our grazing management. But I really just wanted to show you this because this is pointing out small cereals can be as high in crude protein as a really good quality alfalfa hay. So it can be very, very high quality in terms of protein. And then on our TDN basis, we're just short of corn silage on energy if you can keep it immature. So our grazing management is about making sure that we balance the idea of keeping it immature and making sure that we're not limiting intake. So that it's such that the cows get a full bite for every bite. If we do that, we can be very, very successful. So this is, I want to point out, management is going to be key here, and our goal is to keep it in this vegetative state. And what that means is that we want to keep it where our quality is very high, because that's going to help us meet those lactating cows, or your replacement heifers, your growing animals. Either one, they have high requirements. We want to meet them. That means that the amount that's there is going to be fairly low, but that's okay if we manage grazing appropriately. So what do? Daren already said, start at 5 to 6 inches. Okay. One of the key things that I learned with grazing these annuals is they grow fast. About the time you think they're ready to graze, if you're not out there, they're already ahead of you. So start grazing early. Use rotational grazing. Daren kind of mentioned the idea that rotational grazing can be a benefit to increase stocking density, but it also really is a great management tool to keep it in that vegetative state, because you can manage maturity, because you can have higher stocking densities. You can keep it more uniform, don't allow them to be as selective and let some things get away from you. And it also allows you to actually graze when it is in that shorter phase and still have good intake, because they graze it down quickly, you move to the next field, they graze that down quickly, you move to the next field. So I really like 3 or 4 paddocks for grazing. And I know it's a lot of labor, but it's definitely worth it in terms of being able to get more out of the grazing and to keep the quality high. And so you are successful in getting those cows bred. So you want to look ahead. Don't worry so much about leaving stuff in the field. You really want to make sure that you're not letting the other parts of the field get away from you. So your target is to have your forage height no more than 10 inches at any time. So you want to move as quickly as you need to make sure you're not having it get above 10 inches. So in some cases, you might be moving much more quickly, and then you might be able to slow down If, for instance, the weather gets cool, that sometimes happens early in the spring where we might have to slow down the rotation. But the key is 5 to 10 inches is kind of your goal, and grazing management will really help you do that. Now, Daren also mentioned about stocking rate. The thing is that as we think about the growth curve of these plants, they're going to start accumulating more and more growth, so it's increasing. So early, you can have you want kind of a lower stocking rate, and then you want to increase as you go into the grazing season. Now, that sounds kind of simple, right? Except for how do I do that? Well, there's two ways, right? You could increase the number of animals you have out there, or you could reduce the number of acres. And sometimes that means maybe pulling out one of those paddocks out of the rotation, or maybe if you have enough acres, it's a field and you pull out a field and you go to the next thing. And so the key is trying to keep the stuff in that vegetative standpoint. So keeping the grass short. So what does that look like? This is kind of my idea of what good targets are. This is where we're moving from, and this is where we're moving to. If we keep it in that kind of stage, that's kind of ideal. They're out here, they're going to have fairly full bites, so they're going to be able to have intake the way we want them. But we're also being able to keep it short. And so it will come back and it'll maintain that high quality. Now, this is not ideal. And I'm not suggesting that we overgraze quite like I did here. Sometimes things happen and you know, you look and you think, oh, I got another day or two, and then maybe I didn't have another day or two. The thing I do want to point out is that with annuals, they grow fast and they do recover well. So this seems like a big mistake, but honestly, within 7 days, this stuff was ready to graze again. So in some cases, if I don't have high enough stocking density, you know, setting it back a little bit maybe is okay, because then I can keep that higher quality. But ideally, we don't want it to look like this. We really want to stop grazing when it's here. So just FYI, you know, it's not the end of the world. You didn't kill it. I have sometimes thought, surely I've killed it this time, and it's pretty hard to do. The last thing I really want to point out is that if you're grazing lactating cows, or even, you know, maybe you're grazing your replacement heifers on this higher quality forage, you do need to feed a high mag mineral. So high mag, especially for lactating cows, because of the risk of grass tetany, or with your growing animals, there's actually data that shows that providing more magnesium on these types of forages, because they are high in potassium and they are fairly low in magnesium, will increase performance. So it's worth providing a high mag mineral, recognizing that a high mag mineral can be unpalatable. So you want to look for a mineral that they will eat enough of. So look for something that has either molasses in it, or maybe something that says like grain byproducts, because often they'll use distillers as a carrier and it increases the palatability. So you want to make sure you are getting enough intake. That's really why we tell you to start feeding it 30 days before they're going to start calving and or turn out, because we're really just trying to help you have time to gauge, are they eating enough? And if they aren't, you can also add something to it, like adding distillers, like a pound for 50 pounds, or even corn, something to get them to eat it, because it doesn't actually do anything if they're not eating it. And we do definitely want to avoid down cows. Last little plug here, we do have a mineral survey we're working on right now to try to better understand what questions you have and what research needs you have. So if you have some time, I'll put this in the chat in a minute. But if you have some time, you know, later tonight or tomorrow, we'd really appreciate it if you'd take the time to do that. I think with that, Randy, I'll turn it back over to you, and we can open it up for questions.
So we did have a question, and Daren answered it, but just so everybody knows, is asking about a seed shortage, and he said he's not aware of any severe seed shortage this year. He thinks supplies are lower, but seed should still be available. Also, all small grain species perform similarly in growth and production, quality, and grazing management. So that's kind of his answer to that question. Daren, do you have anything to add?
Yes, and I thought about the exception might be to the oats. Typically, you see oats a lot of times classified as grain types or forage types. Either one can be grazed and either one can be harvested for hay. I think the big difference between the grain and forage type designation, oftentimes those forage types, are later maturity. The example that I had on one of those slides in my presentation was that everleaf oat. That was extremely late in maturity, and I don't know if you saw the harvest date on that was well into July when the others were harvested and harvested in I think around the third week of June. And those were harvested at a similar maturity. So it's one that would be extremely late maturity. Goliath is one that's a tall oat. I would classify it as probably medium late maturity. It does have some pretty good yield under adequate rainfall and good growing conditions. Jerry oat is one that was quite common. I've seen a lot of Hayden oat advertised this year. That one is one that I think if you look at it, it's going to be one that's probably a mid maturity, meaning that it's not going to quite have the yield potential to it. A lot of those yields on that slide, while they were ranked a little bit from high to low, there wasn't a great lot of difference in any of the yields when they're harvested at a similar maturity.
So, Daren or Jerry, one of my questions would be about forage quality, and I've always had the thought process, but I appreciate your idea that the later maturing stuff, there's an advantage in the spring because it maintains its quality a little longer. From a grazing standpoint.
Yeah, I would agree with that just because of its growth pattern where, it's going through all of its physiological or maturity stages slower. So you maintain that higher quality phase longer as well.
Jerry, you mentioned flash grazing. So if you're wanting to flash graze a pasture like a summer pasture that you've used, how long, what would be your recommendation for flash grazing?
Sure. Well, with that, and again, you're looking at any cool season grasses or weeds that might be growing early. And so we're talking like, into April, late April, even in some parts of the state. And of course, the amount of growth you have, even with cool seasons, it's going to vary on those spring temperatures, quite significantly. And we are right now probably a little bit behind in terms of our spring warm up and average growing degree days. But when we're talking about that, it's the amount out there of those green grasses is always pretty limited, and so the time or length of time that you are in one of those pastures grazing has to be relatively short and in proportion with the number of cattle that you've got out there. But the whole idea, like I say, is just to get through those pastures, depending on the size again, each day or two, and then that allows you to capitalize on that growth.
So thanks, Jerry. So we have another question. Is there a benefit to providing roughage for cows grazing rye or other spring forages that at that level of quality?
So the data that's out there suggests the answer is actually no. As long as you aren't limiting intake, there's no advantage. In fact, the data I've actually seen, especially with high quality pasture, is that in fact you actually reduce the amount of energy that they consume. So I know it is often thought of as a benefit, and there's only one potential benefit, and that is bloat issues, and that's really been seen mostly with winter grazing of wheat and reducing some bloat potential. I have not seen a whole lot of bloat with spring grazing. And so I do not believe that there's an advantage in doing so. I think it's an extra cost without a benefit. There was a question that got brought up, and Jerry, this kind of goes back to your flash grazing comment. But that question was, so if green up happens in Sandhills Range and you decide to go ahead and basically chase those cool season grasses, what effect might that have on the cattle? And then what effect might it have on the grass, especially after they may have abused it fairly hard last year?
Yes. And the other thing that makes that a little bit more difficult, in most of the pastures are quite short. In other words, there isn't any carryover grass or last year's grass or much left in those pastures. And when that early flash grazing is done most effectively, you do have a little bit of that old growth from the previous year, along with the new green shoots that they are chasing. And again, it's important just to do it for a really short period of time. You don't want to drag it out well into May when to the point where those warm season grasses begin their growth. So it's just kind of a short-term thing. It does take some extra labor, of course, in moving those cows through those pastures quickly.
Karla, you mentioned in your feeds that you used, is there other feeds, alternative feeds that people could use with confined feeding besides distillers and corn stalks?
Well, yeah, assuming that we have them. One of the reasons that I included the corn stalks in it was because if we had hay, we'd still be feeding hay. So that's, we're kind of out of the better quality things. And corn stalks tend to be a cheaper roughage source, although there are no cheap roughage sources this year, unfortunately. And so we can do it with other forage resources. I use the wet distillers because when we are feeding really low quality roughages, the wet distillers kind of soaks up on that, and it kind of helps them not sort that as bad, and they'll eat that a little better. So same with the silage, it kind of helps make that a little more palatable diet. But then also the silage and the distillers add some energy that roughage residue is severely lacking in. And then because of the lactating cow having such a high protein requirement, the distillers does help meet that. So those are the reasons I use that. But, if you're in eastern Nebraska and you can throw in some soybean meal or something like that, because that's what you have, or that's what you can get. I mean, we can do those things. And we just need to evaluate the cost and evaluate the commodity that you have and see if it actually does meet their needs.
Thanks, Karla. We have another question here. Any thoughts on adding P to the fertilizer, adding phosphorus to the fertilizer in addition to N to nitrogen?
Jerry, you've done a little bit of work with that.
Yes, with the phosphorus, yes, you can get a bit of a response. You could put in some 1152O, if you're going through a dry application. And we're usually talking about no more than 20 pounds of actual phosphorus per acre. Ideally, though, if you do have the time, doing a soil test is really the best way to accurately determine phosphorus needs. But the nitrogen side of things, that's pretty well a given what Daren had talked about.
Karla, would straw be a replacement for corn stalks? Wheat straw?
Yeah, I like wheat straw better in a way because it has a little bit higher TDN value, and they do eat it a little better. And this year in our weaned fall calves, I don't like to put it in a young small rumen's diet because, as Mary was talking about, the higher quality stuff and the faster rate of passage, and not putting roughage with that. I don't like to put that in there. But we got into a mess with the blizzard in December and the 65 below wind chills in January, and we fed too much hay. And so I have had to blend some wheat straw with the oat hay and the silage and the distillers for them. And they've gotten along with that a lot better than I thought they would have. And so I had them pull they had been doing like a wheat straw and a corn stalk bale blend, grinding that as a roughage source for the cows. And I had them pull the wheat straw out and save it for the calves. And so there are things that we can do that we don't really like to do that can get us through these rougher periods. And so I guess that would be my recommendation is, you know, if you have like a dry pregnant cow, she can get away with so much less feed resources, and then saving those things for when you do go into lactation and you got to do a better job with the nutrition. If you can kind of inventory your commodities and decide, well, I'm going to have to feed this now because I need to save this later, then the wheat straw would be one of those things that I would kind of save for when I need a little better quality. It's not a lot better, but I do eat it a little better.
Again, if you guys think of questions later, you know, you can feel free to contact us. Our contact information is on the beef.unl.edu website. And we're more than happy to try to help you think through your options. You know, this year has been pretty tough on everybody, and forage is short. So as Karla kind of mentioned, we can work with the feeds you have to try to help you figure out what will work best for you. And so we're more than happy to do that. Just let us know if you got questions about your particular field and planting, those types of things. I'm sure Daren and Jerry would help you out with that as well. So please reach out if you have just even want to just talk through, you think you got an idea and you just want to make sure, reach out to us.